Pork is the most consumed meat on the planet, and its popularity and production are only growing. And along with that growth means more land for growing feed, more greenhouse gases from pig waste, and more water use for raising pigs, all demands that stress communities who are typically underinvested in and often exploited by the industrial agricultural industry. Today on Gulf Streams, we're continuing our deep dive series into the global environmental impact of meat by talking about pork, its production, its future, and the cost of an ever-growing global pork market on the planet. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. I'm joined in the studio today by our researcher and Rice University undergraduate student, Jaden Bray-Boyce, and today we're speaking with two experts who research the global pork industry. Dr. Alex Blanchette is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University and the author of Porkopolis, American Animality, Standardized Life, and the Factory Farm. Dr. Mindi Schneider is Lecturer in Environment and Society at Brown University, the author of numerous articles on food production, consumption, and the global agricultural industry. Dr. Blanchette, Dr. Schneider, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We are so delighted to be speaking with you today and to get to dive into the really impressive and complex and nuanced ways that you're thinking about pork in particular, but really the global food system. And so just to start us off, I want to say, a few weeks ago, we had a conversation with Dr. Joshua Specht about a book in which he explored the role of beef industrialization in the 19th century in the US. And something that I really found interesting and kind of resonant in your work is it's really like this 30-year period that beef suddenly finds a national market and is formed. And in thinking through that and reading across both of you, Alex, I know some of what you write about in the book goes back to the 70s and some trends that are established there. But for so much of the work both of you are looking at, so much of this industry really has come into being since the 90s, that the way that industrial food processes and the really hyper kind of level of control and specific for the global market scale of things you're pointing at is a fairly recent phenomena. And so I find that kind of remarkable. But before we get into a little bit of what some of those changes are, I'm wondering, and I'm going to ask you an overly broad question, and I apologize in advance for it. But I think when people hear the global food system, that feels very murky. That's not really what they're sure of. What does that mean? And I think for a lot of us, we kind of assume, well, my pork is raised somewhere in the Midwest, and then it's boxed up and sent to my grocery, and I buy it, and that's like how the food system works. And what you're both demonstrating is actually it's incredibly nuanced, and products are going all over the world in so many forms, it's almost unimaginable. And so just to start us off for a lay audience, can you walk us through a little bit? What is the global food system, especially in terms of pork? Why is it important to draw our attention to how pork has really taken on an international audience and the ways that the industry survives and has made itself necessitate that model?
Sure, I can start. I can talk about what I think the global food system for pork and meat looks like from the United States.
Please do.
At the risk of a bit of an almost contradiction there. And I'd say two things. First of all, I'd say, I think it's right or correct to say that the United States and perhaps Canada has played a disproportionate role in the development of large-scale industrial meat systems across the 20th century. But at the same time, I think it hasn't done it alone, right? It's developed a lot of these different systems, but there's also been large forms of industrial meat production in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, in France, in Denmark. And I think one of the things that I find intriguing is that whenever we see a new one of these systems pop up, let's say a different system or originally an imitational system in Denmark, you oftentimes see some of the things they do get re-imported back into production systems in the US. And so the first thing I'd say is that like even like American pork production, so-called, is actually like a mixture of genetics projects for pigs developed in France and Denmark, of labor arrangements in Chile. It's just like, it really is like a scouring of the globe for how to, frankly, exploit these animals and re-importing the ideas into systems. The other thing I'll say is from the United States, and this might be different from China or elsewhere, I don't think a lot of industrial pork production has been driven by demand. That's to say, there hasn't been massive amounts of demand amongst people for more and more meat or shortages of meat, except for in very fleeting moments, that has in turn led these systems to scale up. I think the issue for pork production in the US, almost from the get-go of the 1890s, intensifying into the 1990s, has been overproduction.
Wow.
Producing way too much pork than can be consumed domestically. And in turn, to ensure that all of this production isn't unprofitable, they need to continually open up more and more and more export markets, to the point where the company that I studied in the Great Plains, a very large pork corporation, was exporting to like 26 different countries. And that's increasingly the norm when US pork producers are just producing so much meat that increasingly they need global production, global export in order to hit their bottom lines.
Thank you, Sima. That was a big question I opened with, and that was a great explainer. Mindi, I see your head nodding. Do you want to jump in and add on to that?
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those main points that Alex raised for sure. And building on this idea that this has not been a demand-driven development, that industrial animal agriculture is not about people around the world raising their hands and saying, we want more meat, we want to eat meat all the time. That is absolutely not how this story has played out. And unfortunately, I think that we often believe that's how it works because economic discourse is so strong, right? This idea of supply and demand as the sort of process and relationship that defines how the world works is really strong. So that's such a crucial point to say that this is not demand driven. And I think points to also another kind of global aspect of this system is the role of transnational corporations as some of the most powerful players in driving a system, a global sort of system, if we can call it that, of industrial meat production. And so companies that may be based in the US, may be based in Brazil, may be based in China, but really operate transnationally. They have different subsidiaries operating in different countries. And so even when we talk about things like trade between countries, we're talking about trade between companies, right? It's not governments necessarily that are trading. It's companies in particular places that trade soy, for instance. So sometimes you have companies trading with their subsidiaries located in Brazil and China, for instance. And so this role of private firms and of transnational corporations, I think, is another piece that really importantly makes it a global system. And just related to that is also the way that governance happens, not exclusively on a global level, but different countries, of course, have their different laws and policies and regulations and restrictions, and trying to harmonize between different countries for what's allowable in pig feed or kind of just any kind of regulation you can think of. That also becomes a global process when materials like soy, like meat, like products are moving around the world, but also when ideas and technologies are moving around the world. So there's very much the hand of the WTO and other international organizations that play a strong role that I think, as consumers, we're consumers and citizens of particular places, and tend to think that our actions and our voice should be directed to our national or local governments, which of course is true, but so many decisions and so many processes are happening in spaces where we don't have democratic participation in, right? The WTO is not a place where any of us have any sort of democratic connection to. So I think these are other important pieces of global food systems writ large.
Alex, something you focus on in the book is how genetics, which is actually a global dimension of this, as techniques from one country or continent shape how others practice pork production, so that trends in France, as you note, can actually change the genetics of American pork. And one of the things that you note is how we've created the American meat pig. Both we have crafted this new kind of pig that you call the American meat pig, and that's something that is different and removed from what we would typically think of as traditional pigs. And Mindi, I see you're nodding your head as well. And so I'm wondering, can you talk us through a little bit? How have we managed to change animals to fit this kind of industrial mechanized approach to animal production?
Yeah, it's a big question. I hope I don't trip
I
up
know. I'm
the
sorry. We
excitement
have
here, just
it's
because
all the
there's
big
been
questions today.
no, it's just because there's been so many changes to these organisms over decades, if not centuries, right? In some senses, you can say that the project of industrialized pork dates back to the 1890s, right? The Chicago meat packers that were famous were the inspiration for Henry Ford's assembly line, the Chicago meatpacking disassembly line. And there has been a sort of pressure since that time to try to create animals that are ideal for the slaughter system, right? There's been a sort of pressure from above. But I mean, I think we could tick through all the ways that the pig has been changed. I think first and foremost, and this is true especially since the 1990s, there's been a really strong pressure to create uniform pork, right? To try to produce millions of pigs per year that grow to basically exactly 285 pounds in 6 months. Why is that? Partly it's that, further processors will pay a premium. They'll if they can get really uniform, say, pork bellies for bacon processing. Partly it's because there's so many different products that are coming out of pigs. In the company I worked in, there was like 1,100 different SKUs or commodity codes on each pig, right? They needed a kind of uniform base for all of these demands. But I think the most important thing was that these companies were trying to get bigger. And one of their major forms of getting bigger is to increase line speeds, to kill more pigs in a given slaughterhouse in a day, to move from killing 16,000 pigs in a day to 18,000 pigs to 21,000 pigs. To do that, you need a really uniform animal, right? So that workers aren't adjusting on the fly and that you can, essentially push more pork out in a day using a similar amount of materials, of buildings and labor. So that's one way, that we've just seen everything from pigs being forced to live inside permanently to ingesting really complicated, almost like feed cocktails that include drugs, but also an array of different feedstuffs in order to try to ensure this regularity. And then into like the kind of global production of genetics. And the result is, just really kind of stunning. First of all, that a pig that can grow to essentially full size in 6 months, to sows that produce such large litters that there's actually more pigs in a litter than they have teats to nurse, and even to the generation of sows and boars who are so docile that they won't kind of freak out by being locked in crates their entire lives such that they can't turn around. Everything from the mind sentience to the hormones of pigs have been gradually selected and worked on in order to try to continuously create more uniform meat and larger scales of production.
So something else that I wanted to pick up on from your book, Alex, which I think is another kind of running theme throughout, is the ways that in pork production, pigs and humans have, really not just become intertwined, but become inseparable in certain ways. And that the amount of control that the pork production factory farm has taken over the lives of workers. I'm thinking particularly here of a story where you talk about an employee at the farm you're at who is offered a promotion, and in order to take it, his children would have to actually resign their positions at a neighboring farm because there could be crossover of this biomaterial, and that there are concerns that that's going to be, as you were just saying, Mindy, that we've done all this work to breed in a particular way, and now there are these fears of any kind of genetic material having crossover. But just that living implication that if I'm going to take this promotion, my kids can't work somewhere else because of concerns of that kind of intermingling, and the idea that there's that level of control over someone's life. And so I want to turn somewhat to, and you're both many articles you've written, Mindy, and of course this wonderful book, Alex. There's so many examples, but maybe if there's a few really key ones you could walk us through around the kind of health impacts around factory farm life, the labor impacts, and the way that these sites have just taken over employees' lives in really fundamental ways.
I really did naively kind of go into this saying, this book is going to be about work. It's not going to be about animals. It's not going to be about this. It's going to be what's the experience of workers. The reason I say it's naive is I just found that impossible to maintain when I myself started, working in breeding farms and like artificial insemination farms. I just found, actually, I expected to kind of find a scene where there was almost detachment between humans and pigs, right? That like, the pigs are just locked in barns and maybe humans work on them through machines. And instead, I found like intense labor at all things, really just like a deep intimacy or entanglement between, select few highly exploited human beings and select or many highly exploited animals. And I just started coming to see that like we just cannot separate the condition of animal life from the condition of workers' lives. So the example you gave was that, the company that I was studying was really worried that pig disease were going to be transferring across workers' bodies outside of the workplace, right? So if someone works in a breeding farm or a slaughterhouse, they might hang out together inside the house or be part of a family or something like that, and that novel pig diseases would transfer across their bodies. Well, right then and there, we clearly have a pig, an organism that's being pushed to its limits, and that is very biologically fragile, right? Very susceptible to disease, such that you now need to monitor your workers' movements, your employees' movements outside of the workplace in order to maintain this scale of animal production. In other words, you have to remake human kinship, families, sociality in order to maintain this scale of production. Conversely, I think it also goes the other way, through border politics, through straight up racism in the United States. Many wages amongst migrant workers in the rural United States are pretty low. In turn, I saw the use of genetics that produced tons and tons of hogs, but actually kind of fragile hogs that required a lot of labor, right?
Mm.
I don't think those kinds of genetics would be used in places where wages are high.
Mm.
Right? Instead, the company can throw lots of labor at these pigs and get more pigs out. But right then and there, like, I don't think I'm stretching it to sort of say that you can actually identify like US border politics, immigration politics, and racism, and de-skilling, and the persecution of unions and so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Class inequality, right in pigs' genetics. And that's stunning. That just this is a being, the American industrial pig is a being that has been created for work,
Mm.
right? It's been created, as I said before, to you know, to enable the extraction of more work from workers in slaughterhouses and so on and so forth, right? And the very fact this being has been created for industrial labor, for wage labor, right? In turn means that I really do think like the status and condition of pigs and the status and condition of workers at a given time really do kind of refract and reflect each other.
Well, building off of labor, I know you just recently mentioned immigration. Can you talk about how immigration plays a role in expanding or the development of this industry?
Might be a moment. We need to edit a bit. Um, yeah, absolutely. To some extent, I think it's fair to say American meat production has always been, or almost always been, rooted in immigration, right? You can go back to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, his novel from 1906, which was all about, in part, critiquing this idea that new immigrants need to kind of sacrifice themselves within this system. But nonetheless, dating to at least the 1970s and in more recent times, the industry has run almost entirely on immigrant labor, at least at the level of barns and raising pigs and slaughterhouses and so forth. And in turn, it's also necessitated, I think, continually more and more immigrant labor. Something we probably don't talk about enough is that, say, American slaughterhouses tend to average like 100% annual turnover rate, right? That's complicated. It sometimes involves people leaving and coming back, but nonetheless, the entire equivalent of a workforce quits in any given year, right? That's at this point, the speed of the line is moving so fast. People are doing so many repetitive motions. It can be hard to maintain that work day in, day out for years for most people. But that also means that these companies necessitate kind of continually new pools of workers in order to stay afloat. But I'd also want to insist, and one of the things that my book tries to get at is that we also recognize that immigrant workers, especially those who move across sites or have been in these operations for a long time, themselves actually kind of intellectually, their skill underpins this work. In terms of public discourse, it's like, oh, this is unskilled labor or something like that. But I didn't experience that at all when I worked in factory farms. I'd work alongside people that had been, say, in various barns for 8, 9, 10 years, and in turn had witnessed the birth of thousands upon thousands of pigs and had like really specialized knowledge that would allow them to heal kind of, sick pigs or injured pigs. And one thing I did find when I was working in these operations was just a really strong split between management who, infrequently stepped foot in barns, typically white agribusiness educated management that infrequently set foot in barns that kind of just planned things on spreadsheets, and then immigrant workers who really made these systems work out, right? That like in the day to day really made, put in oftentimes quite exhausting, quite caring even work to, try to keep the system from collapsing in one of, frankly, disease and death when we're dealing with these animals that have really been pushed to their limits.
Mindi, I'm wondering if you can talk some about the international context. I know you think a lot about China and also Brazil, but I mean, are these similar stories we're seeing, exist in these other places, or is this a uniquely U.S. approach to agriculture? How does this look on a more global scale?
Yeah, well, I think this comes back to a point that Alex made earlier about the US kind of playing an outsized role in the development of a global industrial livestock agricultural system. Not a solo role, of course, but for sure an outsized role. So when I was doing my field research in China, I was in China for about 3 years, trying to understand how and why the pork industry there was growing at such a rapid and massive pace from the 1980s to the present. When I was there was around 2012 and 13. And it's remarkable that in many of the industrial operations I was in, I felt like I could have been in Iowa. I grew up in Nebraska and in the Midwest, and so I've been in quite a few industrial pig farms in the Midwest. And many of these places in China, they felt the same. It's, a lot of the same equipment supplied by the same equipment dealers. The American meat pig is also the pig that is raised in industrial farms in China as well. In part, this is this globalization of genetics where most operations are raising the same kind of narrow three breeds of pigs. So really similar dynamics in a number of ways. And thinking about labor, Alex's work has been so important for my own thinking and my own way to understand what I was learning about in China. And this issue of migrants and migrant workers, and also the industrial livestock agriculture's need for this very vulnerable, exploitable class of people to work in these operations and to keep it going because of the fragility of the animals, but the fragility of the whole system, really. Um, and so, from Alex talking about the porcine worlds that are made when, a large scale operation comes to a place, it starts to reorient a lot of social relationships in that place and ecological relationships, I would say, too. And in China, the labor especially, I can tell you about a breeding farm that I visited. So this was I shouldn't call it a farm, it's an operation, right? But it was a sow operation. It was a place that was raising um, genetically superior for industrial livestock sows and then selling those sows to other operations. So these same biosecurity fears are there, right? If a germ, if a virus, if something gets into that herd, the herd will be wiped out because the animals are all the same. And that's actually their value. The value for that company is that you're producing these identical sows and you can ensure that standardization when you sell them. So, what that means for people working there, in China, it's very common, and this is similar and different from the cases I know that Alex studied in the United States, but it's common in China that dormitories are built for workers on the site of the industrial operation. So you have these pig barns that go up, you have thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes pigs raised on a single site. And then there's also worker housing that's built there. So workers live on site, and typically they're not allowed to leave that site. And if they leave the site of the farm, the operation. Um, at the place where I was visiting, they needed to quarantine for a month before they could come back to work because
Wow.
of this fear that if they leave and they go home, which they're migrants, but they're migrants from other places in China. They're typically migrants from rural areas, other rural areas. The fear is if they go home and they might get something on their shoes or their boots or their clothes and bring it back in. So there's the required 1 month quarantine that's not a paid month of quarantine. So this really changes where workers are moving to work on an operation, to move there and to not leave there. And the turnaround is also quite intense because a lot of workers will leave once a year for Spring Festival celebrations when they go home to see their family, and they don't come back. They get a different job afterwards.
Mm.
So just again, kind of Alex's idea of these porcine worlds and how the arrival of these operations starts to change so much more than just how pork is produced or how meat is produced. It has these um, pile-on effects that really reach, sometimes thousands of miles away from the operation.
It's so intense, and you know, it's almost so against the story that I typically hear of these operations, right? Which is that's about locking pigs in barns so that everything's just run by machines and it decreases labor. But instead, like that example, which is, you know, more intense or taking things up a level from what I know in the US, is just like example of, at least for some people, of just life becoming work. Um,
Yeah,
Life
absolutely.
being totally consumed by work. Mindy, I was hoping I could ask a question,
Please
actually.
jump in.
Um, so, I was thinking about our conversation, and when I went to move to the Great Plains in like 2007, right? I
Mhm.
was like, I'm looking for the most industrialized of industrial pork operations. And rightly or wrongly, I thought I found that in the United States, right? But I feel like if I was going to try to do that kind of move today, I probably wouldn't be going to the United States, right? It'd
Mhm.
probably be perhaps China, right? Where
Right.
I might not have these figures off, but if I'm not mistaken, China produces 8 times more pork or something to that effect than the
That
United
sounds
States.
right.
It is by
Wow.
far the world's largest pork producer. And at this point, a Chinese origin corporation owns the largest former American pork corporation in Smithfield. And in turn, it does feel to me like, increasingly Chinese agribusinesses and corporations are perhaps shaping the future of global pork production. And so I just wanted to ask, what I think you've given one example there, but what are some ways that we are perhaps seeing Chinese corporate strategies shaping global pork production or the future of pork production beyond what's been
Yeah.
done?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think you're absolutely right. I think if you started your research today and your goal was to find the most industrialized pork production, I think you probably would go to China. And maybe the most glaring example at the moment is something that's been in the news quite a bit in the last couple of years, is that China or Chinese firms, with the support of the Chinese state, have started building what they call pig hotels or pig apartments. And in the United States, industrial pig farms tend to be, well, they're single-story buildings, right? It's a single-story building. That's the confined animal feeding operation, the CAFO. It's a single-story building where you pack all these pigs into. And in China, they've started making multi-story pig farms. And so you have the tallest one currently, I think, is 21 stories. So there's 21 stories. It looks like a high rise. And on each level of that building is 1,000 pigs. So it's taken, I mean, I guess one, you know, mark of the most industrialized is scale in one way. So the scale of this is just absolutely enormous. On a single site, you can have thousands and thousands more pigs. But along with that, it's not just the stacking and the concentration of these bodies. It's also where there's technologies developed around facial recognition. So the same kind of surveillance technology for people is actually developed for pig farming. And these technologies scan a pig's face and they can pick up some particular way a pig's face might move if it's sick. And so this is a way to preemptively cull an animal that gives signs of being sick. And so again, this is about this biosecurity threat, right? It's about this herd mentality, Alex, that you have written so beautifully about, and trying to use technology to solve that problem. So yeah, the stacking of the pigs, the facial recognition technology, but also just AI and other technologies for things like taking temperatures of rooms, for regulating the temperatures of rooms, for where these pigs are, all trying to keep this environment so perfect for these animals that are bred to only be in this environment, that trying to kind of mechanize all that is really what the Chinese are doing very well. I mean, it's working very well. They produce by and large more pork than any other place in the world. And their sort of ascent to the top of pork production over the past 30 or 40 years has really rerouted resources in this global food system. I mean, we can directly link the expansion of soy production in Brazil in particular to feeding all of those pigs in China. It's a direct correlation where we see the history and kind of the operation of these two industries, pork and soy, and maize to an extent, but really pork and soy are inextricably linked. And so this triangle between the United States and Brazil as soy producers and China as the pork producer, that kind of triangle is so impactful in, yeah, the global food system, but also our local food systems, and also what counts as farming, farming, who's in charge of the farming, who's in charge of things moving around. So yeah, I think similarly, by starting with a Chinese pig and the industrialization around it, we can open up so many other vistas for understanding the way that trade and finance and capital and labor is working in the world today.
Yeah, I think that that's so important, and something I've learned from your work to really think about is, you know, in the US, at least in the pork corporations I worked in, they're still more or less sourcing all of their feed from the US Midwest, right? And but you know, when we look at the scenarios you've analyzed, it's like, you know, we're talking about truly the globalization of factory farming, right? Where feed is being transported all over the world. And I think it's just a really important thing to emphasize in a context where we continually hear that these operations are quote unquote efficient, meaning that they allegedly use less land and less space through the concentration of these animals. And it's like, no, come on, with all of the every growth in the scale of animals, it is tied to particular fields and transformations of ecologies elsewhere. That was once perhaps, at this point, the entire US Midwest and Great Plains. But I mean, your work just shows us that this is increasingly being stitched together as a global project, to the point where even if pigs might be stacked up in hotels, their shadow or their arch is sprawling across the perhaps more land surface than any other process at this moment.
I so appreciate you drawing us to some of those broader ecological questions, because it's something we always want to talk about, is what are some of these environmental implications. Before I give you a chance to jump into that, though, I think Jaden has a question for you, Dr. Schneider.
So pork is one of the most popular, if not the most popular type of meat that is consumed. And so this is obviously quite evident in your article in relation to China. So would you be able to walk us through the ways the cultural attitudes around pork are changing and what that means for diets as well as meat production globally?
Yeah, so I mean, in my work, it's really based in China, of course. So the argument that I make in some ways is really just about China. And one of the things that I've argued is that pork has this long, deep cultural, historical, and agroecological significance in China, from the fact that the southern part of China today is one of the sites of pig domestication 8,000 years ago or something. And so for most of Chinese history, most people were rural and most people had one or two pigs. This is just thousands of years of history where people were having pigs. And people weren't eating that much pork, but the pigs were really central to how their farming and food systems operated, in part because they produced most of the fertilizer that were able to grow the grains that were the heart of people's grain-based diets for thousands of years, right? So there's all kinds of evidence of the role of pigs kind of in the imagination of what makes a home, but also what makes food and what makes a farming system. So with kind of the shift that we can trace in China to industrial production comes in the 80s, and it was on the heels of China's reform and opening in 1978, which was the political economic move out of the socialist era into more of the capitalist era, right? And so it was opening the country to more trade, it was privatizing more companies, it was essentially liberalizing with still some state control, of course, the economy. And one of the first sectors of focus for liberalization was the pork industry and the feed industry. So already really early on, as leaders in China at that time are planning and implementing this massive change to how the country's economy is going to work, pork is central there. And I think that's both because it can be understood as something that was going to make quite a lot of money, but I think it also captured something about people's hearts and bellies, because pork was this, at Spring Festival, you eat pork. At weddings, you eat pork. And people historically, again, didn't eat pork very often. It was really at these special moments.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say this for Chinese people in general, but of course there are minority groups in China, the Hui minority who are Muslim, who do not eat pork. But in general, we can say overall pork was really important. And so pork also during the socialist era, pork was more rationed. It wasn't, at times pigs were collectivized. So this long history of how pigs were raised changed, and pork wasn't as available, and people ate pork on coupons. So you needed a coupon to get pork. And so I think there was, perhaps people were eating less pork at that time, even though they hadn't been eating very much in general. But I think that also constructs this idea of scarcity, right? When you have to have a coupon to get the pork, it's like, I'm not getting very much. I'm not getting pork. I have to have this coupon. So making a focus on pork at the time when the country is opening, I think was also a really strong way to legitimize the state's plans, right? If suddenly people could eat pork much more often, or some kind of the rising consumer class, which is also constructed through making pork more available to consume, this is a real sign of progress for people. This was a real sign, kind of very embodied experience and sign that things were getting better, things were getting modern, that this plan to open the country, this is really working. And so it's kind of like making people's pork dreams come true. So I think it carried in China, again, this is a particular story, it carried that real long historical cultural significance that became something that could help legitimize the state, legitimize consumer culture, and start building this notion of consumer culture as well about, people kind of having identity and status around what they could buy, what they could afford to buy, how often they could buy something like pork. So it's been very important there. And, now there's more pork produced and eaten in China than any other place, which on some level is absolutely a mark of the success of this reform, right? I mean, we have to ask really critical questions about what we mean by success, but just in terms of looking at how successful that industry has been in terms of growth, it's powerful.
I so appreciate that. And I really, I'm so grateful we've had the time to kind of think through the myriad components of labor here, of animal welfare, of various aspects of these environmental consequences. But I do, we are an environmental show first and foremost. And so I'm curious, as we draw to a close here, if there are other really important impacts. You've already mentioned, manure and waste. But if there are other environmental impacts we should be attuned to as we think of industrial farming and particularly meat and pork production, and what are some of these effects that we should know about and be mindful of as we think about what this global industry is having impact on in terms of our planet and our planetary health.
I mean, I think the trick here is that we end up just checking through a list of many different effects. And I think it's important to check through those lists, right? Because there is a bit of a discourse emerging right now that like we should only think about the environmental problems of meat production through, say, greenhouse gases, right? And then so you'll get someone say, oh, the problem is really cows or sheep, right? Ruminants produce more methane through belching, right? Instead, what we need to do is try to push people to eat more chicken or something like that. But it's not like a single dimension. We have the pollution of waterways through feces. We have certainly methane and greenhouse gases, but also, industrial animals consume more antibiotics globally than do humans, right? They are arguably or probably, one of their diets are one of the leading sites of the growth of antibiotic resistance. And similarly, we also have the potential problem of zoonotic diseases, right? Most large zoonotic diseases, that's to say, oftentimes very damaging diseases, jump from animals and oftentimes farmed animals to humans. And when we, compound, millions upon millions of animals, identical animals in closely confined spaces, we perhaps only make that worse.
I can add maybe. I agree about this list, that the list is both important and not enough. One thing I want to add to the list that I've been trying to think about, and would love, Alex, to hear what you're thinking about this too, is so the rate of animals that die in industrial pork production before being slaughtered is around 15%, the kind of mortality rate, right? So I've been thinking about that sort of everydayness of death in the industrial operation. And then the death that comes from pandemics. So the outbreak of African swine fever in China a few years ago, there were 300 million pigs that were culled. Not that died, but they were preemptively culled, right? So thinking about what happens to all of these carcasses, because we're talking about millions of tons of flesh. And sometimes it's flesh that's infected, but it's certainly flesh that's full of antibiotics, like Alex mentioned. And what seems to be the case, the regulations in different countries that I've looked at are often to compost the carcasses and or to liquefy the carcasses. And often that's turned into kind of a resource that either can be pumped through center pivot irrigation in the United States as additional nitrogen and phosphorus for crops, which, by the way, they don't need much more nitrogen and phosphorus because they're already, fertilized. So we get runoff from that as well. Or in some cases, carcasses buried in mass. And so, in China today, after African swine fever, there were all of these spaces where millions of tons of dead pigs were buried. And I don't think we know what the implications of that are going to be, but it's something else I would put on the list. And I would say maybe less on the list and more kind of, I think, a general environmental and other comment is that rather than kind of tweaking industrial production and thinking about how can we make it a little, maybe less methane, or maybe we capture manure and turn it into something useful, I think it's well past time to deal with the question of how much is enough and how much is too much, right?
Yeah.
And the entire system is so based on growth, as capitalism is so based on growth and expansion, that I think in many ways we're asking the wrong questions when we're asking questions about how to make this a better form of production, without asking, when is it going to register that there is too much meat being produced, both in the sense of overproducing. There's also too much meat being consumed, even though some places in the world want to consume more meat to kind of catch up, this discourse of Americans and Western Europeans eat so much meat, and the rest of the world has the right to eat that much meat too, that we can't be saying to other places, you can't eat as much meat. But I don't know how we address those issues without ever addressing the question of how much is too much. And so for me, I think this question of growth and, kind of overriding planetary boundaries, wherever those might be, is so central in thinking ecologically and socially about this and other systems that we live in.
I agree, like 1,000%. I think it's so important. It's something I'd want to tag on exactly as you put it is another environmental issue I don't think we think about enough is how much science, knowledge, human energy is being dedicated towards trying to make these systems work out in ways that are like profound distractions, right? Whether we're talking about, in the case of the farm I studied, that takes all of the fat from pigs and tries to turn it into biodiesel and call it a green project, or this new emergence of so-called biogas, right? Of trying to create yet another commodity from the methane of hog waste, right? These are clearly band-aids. In fact, they're actually efforts to create yet more commodities within organisms that already have thousands of commodities coursing through them, right? But yet to do that requires, tons of knowledge from universities, tons of government subsidization and so forth,
Yes.
and all these things that would be better dedicated towards other solutions or other directions and so forth. And to me, though it sounds almost flippant given all of the things we've talked about, I think one of the tragedies of things like factory farming is precisely how much just human knowledge and energy and lives and so forth that it absorbs, in addition, of course, to animal lives, in order to keep it afloat. And lastly, I'll just say, I think we both talked quite a bit about, fragility and the brutality of a lot of these conditions, right? Whether we're talking about, antibiotic usage or pig carcasses. And I'm not sure how Mindi feels about this, but I also want to emphasize, to me, part of the point here of emphasizing the fragility and the pollution and so forth of these operations isn't just to sort of say they're really bad, right? It's to actually like push against the sense that they're inevitable. In so many discourses, there's a sort of sense, yes, this isn't ideal, or this isn't perfect, but it's what we need to do, or it's what we have to do, or it's just the nature of capitalism or something like that. But that distracts us from seeing just how much work is put in to try to keep these incredibly fragile systems afloat. And for me, a lot of my work these days is really about asking, like, how can we build movements and discourses and collaborations that get people and institutions and others to start withdrawing their tacit support.
I just think it's important for people to also understand. I know it's been important for my thinking to be able to have an orientation to this that's at a level of a system, because it helps us situate farmers, the farmers that still exist, which are not that many, honestly, who've been able to sort of survive as industrial farmers. But to understand farmers as kind of sitting between firms and government supports and subsidies, and it's not to take away the personal responsibility of individual farmers, but in public discourse, there's a lot of kind of, you know, just thinking that the problems are these farmers all are making these bad decisions and they don't care and they're, enemies of the environment. And it's so much more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it can be tricky to talk about. In many of my cases, there weren't any farmers at all, right? It was
Right.
corporations directly controlling things. But though I think there's certainly moments where we can point to like particular corporate actors or companies that had power. They were kind of like greedily transforming this system. A company called IBP in the 1970s, Wendell Murphy, a North Carolina legislature and ag producer in the 1990s. I also think to some extent it's like there is this sort of sense that it's greedy corporations, and I mean it is, but at the same time, the challenge here is that anyone entering into one of these companies now is operating within a scenario that if they don't do this, if they don't like maintain gestation crates, if they don't try to put in something wildly even offensive to try to reduce the cost of production by 4 cents a pound of pork, then the other company is going to do it. And all of these different companies are ultimately competing on price, right? They're just all competing to try to have the lowest price, which is profoundly challenging. And to me, it's like, though I think we should absolutely be critical of, say, management of a particular company, we should also understand that they are driven by broader forces. And I think we should be a little bit more critical of many of the people who, at least as I see it, aren't as driven, such as, say, American agricultural science professors who have built out a lot of the infrastructure of this, and in my opinion, were never really compelled to, and so on and so forth.
No, that's really helpful.
Absolutely.
Well, I absolutely want to bring you both back on to answer exactly that question and continue a conversation around how we can make progress on that. Because I think that's a brilliant place to stop, and an important part of what you've both been talking about, and how we're thinking about these issues more globally and in the U.S. And so I'm just so grateful for your time. Dr. Alex Blanchette is the author of Porkopolis: American Animality, Standardized Life in the Factory Farm, and Dr. Mindi Schneider is lecturer in Environment and Society at Brown University. Dr. Blanchette, Dr. Schneider, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an illuminating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And now we'll turn to our researcher, Sienna, who has an update on ways to get involved around town in Houston this week.
Hey everyone, this is Sienna coming to you with some upcoming opportunities to get involved. Looking for ways to make a difference in your community? Look no further than Memorial Park Conservancy. Nationally distinctive for its size, location, and composition as an urban wilderness and active recreation park, Memorial Park spans an impressive 1,500 acres. It's Houston's largest urban center park. But Memorial Park isn't just about size. It's about the unique blend of urban wilderness and recreational space it offers. With approximately 30 miles of trails, including a 600-acre urban wilderness, it's a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. Now, take the opportunity to join Memorial Park Conservancy on Thursday, March 14th from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. for Land Bridge and Prairie Conservation Horticulture Volunteer event. Be sure to sign up as a volunteer on their volunteer tab of their website. By becoming a volunteer at Memorial Park Conservancy, you are joining an organization dedicated to the restoration, preservation, and enhancement of Memorial Park. You'll learn insider tips on gardening in Houston's natural climate while participating in tasks like pruning, seed collection, planting, trash pickup, and invasive species removal. It's a hands-on opportunity to contribute to the preservation of this beautiful urban wilderness. Don't forget to bring a water bottle, snacks, sunscreen, hat, sunglasses, gardening gloves, or bug spray for your personal comfort. Closed-toed shoes or boots and long pants are required. Please wear clothes that can get dirty and are weather appropriate. Parking is available for $2 for 3 hours. Paid parking is through the Park Houston mobile app or in-person kiosks. And meet in the center of the parking lot, then walk to the work site. If you have any questions, email volunteer at memorialparkconservancy.org, or give them a call at 713-863-8403. They can't wait to see you there.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we're talking about obstacles to the climate movement and how to better mobilize labor movements to join in the fight for a cleaner planet. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.